Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Today, we are blessed and honored to have Steve Beaman, our founder and chairman, join us. And first and foremost, Steve, I want to say thank you personally. You're the brainchild of this. Got it going this year, even with COVID and all the wackiness that 2020 has brought. And in less than 3 months, the McGraw Council has been able to help and support over 200 small businesses nationwide. So thank you very much for all that you're doing, Steve.
Well, I am very appreciative, and I apologize for my camera blowing out on us today. But as we've said, small business teaches you to jump on the fly. But it's a pleasure, John. And I, like you, I am so pleased that we're able to help the small business community as we go through what has been a very difficult year. And with continued cautious optimism for 2021, that we'll get through this and move forward, especially with the news today out of AstraZeneca that another vaccine has been found. So hopefully we've cracked the code of this virus once and for all.
Amen to that. And when you're talking about opportunities and such, that could be a potential game changer, especially for traditional brick and mortar, restaurant, retail, that type of thing. And that's actually kind of like the perfect segue with everything going on in the stock markets, the finance industry. What's going on in there that's like most pertinent to small businesses currently? I mean, I know we still have Black Friday coming up, Cyber Monday, obviously holiday sales, but what are you kind of seeing?
Well, I think as you look at the differentiation between the large and the small, you have two dimensions to look at. One is capital flow, because small business constantly need capital like every other business. And then the second is demand side for their business. And I think on both of those, the small businesses are in a rather precarious position as we enter the end of the year. Let me start with the demand side. Clearly in the restaurant hospitality industry, you're seeing in Michigan, they just announced new shutdowns, and New Mexico they did. And we're seeing the governors of these various states focusing almost all of the pain onto the restaurants and the convention centers, community halls. That's a real problem because they rely on this time of the year to fund a big part of that early part of next year, which will be slow. Secondly, the retailers themselves on the bricks and mortar side are a little bit concerned because to the extent these governors are able to scare the populations from going out, the bricks and mortar retailers will do poorly, a la the Amazons with their delivery schedule. So I think the small to mid-sized guys have to be a little bit nervous right now, but again, always optimistic that America's waking up to the needs of small business.
Optimistic and also having the ability and focus to adapt. And the kind of key word in 2020 has been pivot. And I mean, obviously for restaurants, there's been a lot of talk about curbside ordering, delivery, so on and so forth. That's going to be a fundamental component for many restaurants in these states: California, Illinois, Michigan, New Mexico, New York. When we're talking demand, is that limited or decreased demand strictly due to the lockdowns / shutdowns, whatever term we want to use? Or are we also seeing a massive change in consumer behavior where they're simply going to be spending less at these restaurants and brick and mortars?
Well, I think it's a combination of all the above. First of all, the demand side, as you see from the numbers, has come back very strongly in the last quarter.
When we're allowed to stay open.
Right. And I think so. What you have is you take that in concert together with the technological changes that have taken place. I think for the small commercial operator in terms of commercial real estate, the move into virtual space is going to be extremely challenging for them. And again, the trickle down from that into cleaning services and everything else is going to be challenging, but it creates new opportunities for them as well. As you and I have discussed, the ability to virtually network across the country in live spaces through Zoom or through virtual reality like the council does, those are going to create opportunities to spread the word of your product wide and far. I mean, I'm a little reminded of when Walmart came out and people within certain segments of society hated Walmart because they said this is the death knell to small business. No, it really wasn't. It just changed it. It went from small retailers to small manufacturers who now had immediate distribution of their products. So my belief, John, in small is that they're little speedboats and they'll adapt. They'll change direction when they need to. And I think at the end of the day, the miracle of the American enterprise, experience that's manifested in the micro and small businesses will sustain and grow. I think we'll just have to adapt.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that's one of the consistent things in the American economy and our young history, so to speak. We're always, that small business entrepreneur is always finding a way. It can be painful at times, it can be rough as heck, but we find a way. And that's actually another good segue. And you had sent me an article earlier this morning. We were reviewing it earlier today. And it was about how small businesses can prepare for the holiday season, trying to make the most of it. I mean, like we had already discussed, brick and mortar, retail, traditional restaurants, that type of thing. They're obviously going to have a very, very different look and feel to their holiday specials. But again, to your point about adapting with the current economy, this one article from LegalZoom, it talks about converting those traditionally in-person interactions to that virtual world. As you talk with a lot of business owners, what are you seeing and hearing them do to prepare for the holiday season, to try to keep their business not only surviving, but thriving?
Well, I want to start at the top on this, John, and move downward from that, because one of the many challenges of the world of the small business is that the owner operator rarely has time to sit back and brainstorm and think about how their business is positioned for a change like this. I would urge people to get involved in the council and let those virtual networking events and brainstorming events serve them for that. So that would be my top down. I think as you look to the actual implementation of these changes, some of the things we're seeing are inevitable. The world of going virtual, inevitable. That's been going on for years. It's just accelerated through this. I think you can look at that as faster distribution of your products, lower cost distribution of your products in many ways. That's all good. Again, you have some carve outs of this. If I'm a restaurateur right now, I'm going, how do I just shut down indoor dining and become a carry out only? Mm-hmm. But that begs the question, can the carry out only services deliver a hot, fresh meal in a timely fashion? And there's mixed result on that right now.
Mixed result, and it also depends upon your geographic location. I mean, I haven't been to New York, but all the classic pictures you see of New York City, because you've been, it's kind of slammed. But now with everyone locking down, they have more variability there. Here in Rockwall, Texas, as of next year, all the roads going in and out of the county are going to be under construction, so it's going to greatly limit that delivery capability. And to your point, yeah, that restaurateur is going to have to take a few minutes to sit down and really think about how to adjust his or her business to adapt to that current business environment.
It's never easy to change, but we need to make change our friend. We have one of our sister companies, McGraw Capital, had funded a transportation company out in New York. And when COVID hit and the transportation companies from a social standpoint were just shut down, that guy retooled and became a medical transport company. That was smart. Wow. We've seen a lot of companies go from basic manufacturing, converting over to making PPE equipment, or sanitizer. Those are good examples of how business can adapt. I think, the hardest part now for our colleagues in the small world is just trying to have some kind of forecast on what's going to happen in 21. I was talking again with one of our sister companies, Exiva, this morning, that does accounting and bookkeeping for companies. And the challenge they've got in developing 2021 plans for those companies is you've got really two paths. Path number one, how do I plan in a shutdown? Path number two, what if that doesn't happen?
Right.
And those are very expensive decisions.
And they're very opposite in nature, because to your point, that's planning space, it's real estate, it's equipment, operations, supply chains, logistics, and there's really no easy way to say it. I think if you're looking at the states that have been closed down the longest or are more open to a shutdown, Michigan, Illinois, California, New York, my gut instinct, again, you don't want to make big decisions like that on a gut instinct, but gut instinct would tell you that's probably going to continue for a while. Whereas if you're in a Florida or Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, something like that, it's probably going to be a little more on the open side. But I do want to actually kind of go back. You mentioned that example of the transportation company that shifted so dramatically. Could you please elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think that's a prime real world example of how a small business took something that was shutting it down and went from 100% capacity to 0% capacity, and then was able to adapt and pivot to a situation where it can now thrive.
I think it's also an example where the McGraw Council was able to provide a holistic solution for that small business.
This is true.
So this is a small transportation company. They provide party limousines and that type of thing. When all this hit, they're obviously shut down and going, oh my gosh, how do we pay our bills? How do we pay our employees? How do we handle this? And in conversations with other members of the council, they came up with the idea of trying to shift into a medical transport company. So they were able to use their limousines to come in and do transportation of mobile, so not, terribly bad shape patients, but mobile patients into nursing homes, into hospitals. And they were able to do that enough that it kept the company going during that shutdown. That's where they used, just real quick, John, I think it's important to note they used McGraw's not only counsel, but they used McGraw's capital and McGraw's accounting to help them do that.
Well, that's the whole purpose, to your point, of establishing the McGraw Council, is to be that resource center for small businesses, and then to bring that holistic solution, so you're not having to piecemeal everything together. I mean, yeah, you can get to that end destination that way, but if you can have everything all lined up in one streamlined path, not only do you improve the effectiveness, but you gain a ton of efficiency.
There's no question that the small business community, more than ever today, needs to stand together. And that's what the council is all about. So let me go back to the other side of this, though, since I know we're on limited time on these podcasts. I want to talk about the capital side. We have clearly seen the U.S. stock market surge in response to the two potential antiviral treatments that are coming out of the vaccines. But what you've seen in the U.S. market is almost an unprecedented split between growth and value stocks. In other words, everybody's buying what have been historically called the FANGs: Facebook, Apple, Netscape, and Google. And they're taking these growth companies and running them as fast as they can, leaving the more traditional value-oriented stocks behind. If you look at investors like Warren Buffett, he is a value investor. So his stocks are underperforming today. But if you think about a rubber band that's being stretched, the value and growth stocks are being stretched to historical limits. So that would say the value stocks will come back in 21. What does all of that mean for the small business, though? It's a change in capital flows. What will happen is, as the markets destabilize a little bit through that transition, people will be looking for alternative places for capital, whether it's fixed income or equity plays even. And I think you could see the private equity markets open up once again to the small. Let's talk the high end of the small, the 20 million and up companies. Mm-hmm. They'll be there to fund some of that. But if you look at the alternative finance world, again, our sister company, McGraw Capital, plays in that space. I think the alternative finance world is going to be ready in a big way to step up for these companies' working capital needs.
So when you're talking working capital and all of that, can you walk us through an example of how it's changing and is currently versus the way it was even a year ago pre-COVID? I'll give you an example. Maybe it's an HVAC company. Maybe it's a pest control business, with a contract with a governmental entity, or it could be a cleaning company with a governmental entity. How has that changed from a year ago, and where is it going?
I think it has changed dramatically, and I think people are beginning to see it. If we go back and follow the tradition and the history of banking in the country, after Sarbanes-Oxley in the early 2000s, you saw some significant regulatory increases, which caused banks to pare back the small. It wasn't that noticeable. It was a slope downward, if you will. Mm-hmm. But then Dodd-Frank, after the 2008 financial crisis, Dodd-Frank came in and dramatically impacted the banks. And so they began turning away from small, especially micro. And they began limiting credit lines. They began stopping the inventory lines that they would give people. We've seen that continue. And this COVID thing, I think, has put a nail in the coffin. I think that Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
I think businesses have seen and will continue to see, if you're in the contracting business, you're in, to your point, the pest control business, you're in any of these small and micro businesses, you're going to be unable to get the working capital out of the traditional banking system. They're not going to issue lines of credit on your receivables because they have no assurance those receivables will come due. They don't want to issue lines against inventory because they have no assurance that inventory will turn. And so banking has become, I've used the phrase, and I don't want to create a political storm with it, but it's almost becoming a public utility. And that is the goal of the left. I mean, if you look at Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, they see banking as a public utility, not a profitable business. And as that happens, the risk parameters around banking will continue to change that affect the small business. So when companies come to us, they're looking for inventory financing, they're looking for purchase order and accounts receivable financing. They're looking for expansion capital. You've got a restaurant that is doing well and they may want to add an oven to add space. You've got a contractor that wants to add equipment to their ability. These people can't go to the standard banking system, so they go to the alternative finance world.
So kind of $1 million question here then. Are you aware of anything that would change the way that industry functions significantly coming down the pipeline? I mean, are we?
No,
there,
in fact, my concern's on the other side of it, that government eventually, pardon me, and I don't think it'll happen quickly, but depending on the political winds in Washington, you could see the government trying to restrict more and more the alternative finance world, which is really the last bastion of capital for these small businesses.
Do you think, again, this is a governmental discussion, not a political one, do you see that being more of a state regulated component, or if that industry ends up getting more regulated, would that be administered on the federal side or the state side?
I think one has to be cognizant of the changes going on in Washington, first and foremost. And I think the regulations could come out of Washington to make it a more standardized federal thing. I don't think the alternative finance world is on the radar right now. There has been some state level push against what's known as a merchant cash advance, but all of those have been shot down. The small business community has said, we need these things. This is our last bastion of available capital. So I think that the industry of alternative finance will be able to be a friend to small business for a long time to come.
Okay, that's good to hear at least. So then another question here, maybe about 5 to 10 minutes or so here, then we'll wrap up. When you're talking capital flow, pairing it with demand, and you throw in the holiday season, what should small businesses be on the lookout for in that alternative financing realm? Because with my somewhat limited understanding of alternative financing, I'm immediately saying, okay, you could potentially have massive orders coming in from a traditional brick and mortar. You could have contracts here coming up. Talk to us a little bit about the applicability specifically during the next 6 weeks or so. We've got Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas, New Year, so on and so forth.
I think, John, what I would do there is throw out cautionary words to the micro and small business. There have been true horror stories about the business person getting into desperate straits because they need $20,000 within 3 days or they're in trouble. And as a result, they do a Google search and they find lenders who will certainly put money in their pocket. But I've seen interest rates well over 100%. These are things where you borrow $15,000 and you pay back $1,500 a month for the next 10 years. I mean, I don't have a problem with that in a free market. I think people should, be buyer beware. But with that said, I would urge the small and mid-tier companies and micro companies to really try to build a relationship with an alt finance company. You've had a relationship with your banker for years. Use the alt finance world to do the same thing so that you can work with them and have some forecast on the capital that you're going to need coming through this type of period. So I guess my first advice would be that cautionary note. Don't just throw it against the wall when all of a sudden you're desperate for money. Try to plan that capital need ahead of time so that, there's something you and I've talked about often in accounting called a pro forma. A pro forma is very simply just a statement of income statement and cash flows and balance sheets looking forward 6 months, 9 months, a year. if a micro or small business owner operator watching this today doesn't develop or have one of those, I would welcome them and urge them to reach out to the council and let us help you build one. Short-term cash planning is critical. You should never be in a position where you say, oh, this Friday I need money. You should be in a position to say, oh, in 2 months I look like I run out of cash. I better start planning for that. And I think that's the biggest kind of second thing that I would say to the micro and small is get that pro forma lined up, be as honest as you can on it, and try to look yourself in the mirror and say, on scenarios, if things go well, if things go mid, and if things go poorly, where's my cash? And will I need further cash to come out of this or build up to this kind of, fourth quarter effect?
It's interesting you bring that up. And you were believe you were able to come by for a few minutes last week when John Cozy with McGraw Capital presented in our virtual reality. And he mentioned a few of those exact same things. Build that relationship with an alternative financing partner. Not that you have to use it right away, but if the need ever arises, it's a much easier and cleaner conversation when you have a pre-existing relationship. And then, of course, the pro formas and the financial metrics and the measurements on all of that, it's absolutely essential, because you also have to look at it from the perspective of what makes me a good party for a financer to work with. Because if it's just a one-way transaction that benefits only one party, probably not a great business transaction if it takes place at all.
Well, and the reality is the alt finance world is coming of age. As it started 10, 15 years ago, it was very much a transactional business. You need money, I'll give you money. It's evolving, I hope, into a relationship in which the financing company that you work with understands the totality of your business and can give you a comprehensive solution. Certainly that's what we're about, but I think others will come along and join that bandwagon in the relatively distant future, in the relatively near term, because they have to.
Mm-hmm.
Relationships mean much more than transactions.
That is so true. And it also leads to better and improved long-term business relationships. When it's strictly transactional, it comes down to a price war, and that's like, it's a dime a dozen. But when you get that relationship business going, to your point, it's much more than just one transaction. It's a long-term business relationship. And that leads to much improved business practices, effectiveness, efficiency. It's much easier to solve complex issues when you have that business relationship. I can go on and on about it, but I wholeheartedly agree. And I've seen it personally.
Well, so again, we would recommend that anybody watching this, if they run a small business, work together with their accounting firm, or if they can't get it there, call us. Put together a detailed 6-month pro forma, know where you stand, and then look for solutions to the problems that creates. I can't tell you how many times, John, I've seen people calling us for capital, and they're looking to Band-Aid a bleeding thing. We're not going to fix it. It's like we may make them feel good for the next month or two, but they're going to have the exact same problem in 2 months. And so people end up making strategic decisions that are really wrong, because they haven't looked ahead, because they're too busy running the business to begin with. So especially as you come through what is a transitional Black Friday fourth quarter, folks need to be getting counsel about that. There are groups like the Tech Group, which is now called Vistage International, and they do business coaching. I'm a big fan of that for people. I think business owners need to have somebody they can talk to. And that's where I think what you're doing at the council stands up, because it is a not-for-profit. It's out to genuinely provide education and advocacy and community. I think people need to take advantage of it, because you've got to spend an hour a week outside of your business looking at it.
Okay, so there's the metric: 1 hour a week working on where the business is going, working on the business, not in it.
At least, it's just not done often enough. If you look at a well-run larger company, they've certainly almost all cases separated the role of CEO and COO. Mm-hmm. And that's because the chief executive is really built to do strategy and finance. The COO is there to run the operations. They are disparate functions. And the reason for that is simply that they have to be. I mean, it's
two different functions. It's the reason on football teams, you have an offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, receivers coach, defensive backs coach. You go all the way down the list.
That's exactly right.
Specialization.
So, I think as people look for that, it's all good. The businesses really need to have that sounding board they can talk to, and it's an important function.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Steve, I want to thank you so much for your time. We're running out here today, but thank you so
Well,
much for
before
jumping
we
on.
break, John,
Oh, please, we got more.
I want to show people why we don't have me on camera, if it even works. Because it's kind of fun. See, you see all that? Anybody who wanted to know why we elected not to put me on camera is because of all that wonderful static that you get.
But see, that's the point of small business, though. You never know what life's going to throw at you, so you just adapt. Or in 2020, the keyword, you pivot.
Yeah, and I'm going to stop that because that's giving me a headache. But anyway, I appreciate you're always putting these together, John. I think there's valuable content and ideas for the micro and the small. Again, I come out of the industries like at Wharton Econometrics, where I worked with the Fortune 100. These are the kind of discussions we had. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to bring that kind of capability down to the small.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Steve. I truly appreciate your time. And y'all, if you haven't liked our page, please definitely like our Facebook page and drop a comment here as well. If you've used alternative financing or if you have pro formas in place, what have you done that worked? And if you haven't done it yet, what are some of those questions that you have? Let's keep this conversation going. Like our Facebook page, drop a comment. And remember, we're bullish on the American dream and we're bullish on your future.